Welcome to studios of Faculty of Communication. Today we are interviewing Dr. Marwan Kraidy. Dr. Kraidy is a professor of communication in Annenberg School of Communication at University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Dr. Kraidy.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Today we would like to talk about mostly the media, Arab media, and then your expertise. First, I would like to start with a question about your latest book. We know that you wrote a wonderful book about reality TV and Arab media, and you argue that you mostly discussed how the media affects politics in the Arab Peninsula or in the Middle East generally. And related to that, I would like to ask you a question about how global, post-Fordist especially, media industries and global media or transnational media are shaping societies in the Middle East. And my second question, very much related to that, is what do you think about the impact of media in the Arab Spring, for the Arab Spring?
Okay. Well, one of the interesting assumptions that you face when you're dealing with the connection between media and politics is the focus on news. And people often think that news is really where media influences politics. In other words, the news covers tend to cover politics, and therefore they think that's where the connection is. For many of us, that's not the case, or that's not only the case. And so we look at popular culture also as a space where the connection between politics and culture happens. And so this was the case with me when I started doing research. The book did not start out to be about reality TV. It started as a general book about entertainment media. I was interested in music videos, I was interested in game shows and variety shows, but also in reality TV. And what happened was I was on leave for one semester, and I was traveling between Beirut and Dubai. And I was in the city of Byblos in Lebanon, which is a very old, small city north of Beirut, where we were going to a piano concert. Actually, my brother was giving a concert, and I had my son with me, and he was 2 years old. And so he crosses the street, and there were cars coming, and of course, you have a little boy crossing the street, you scream his name for him to come back. And I screamed his name, and literally we had a couple of dozens young teenagers, mostly girls, surrounding us, and it turns out my son's name, which is Bruno, is the name of a contestant on one of these shows. And so that experience really illustrated to me how popular these shows were. And from there on, I started noticing that reality TV was not only about singing and dancing, but was about more important political issues, including voting in elections, the notion that people win by being elected as opposed to by being appointed or by being decided as the winners, the notion that men and women could equally contest the show, the interventions by politicians and religious clerics who said these shows were bad because of this, because of that. And so these shows were a lot more than just entertainment. They triggered political discussion, but they also hosted interactions among different people that could be described as political for a variety of reasons. And so that's what the book investigated in several case studies, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Lebanon, and Syria mostly, looking at how people who get together as supporters of one reality show contestant, they create a certain political infrastructure to talk to each other, to mobilize other people, and ultimately to vote for whoever they want to vote for. And I was interested in looking at the extent to which that kind of behavior and infrastructure can be transferred to the domain of real politics, where if you mobilize for a political candidate, you vote for a political candidate, you attack his opponents and things like that. And I found out that this was the case. I also found out that a lot of the contestants on reality shows, so unlike a lot of reality shows in the US or in Turkey, for instance, Arab reality shows tend to be pan-Arab. In other words, they tend to have participants from all the Arab countries, 24 Arab countries. And when you have participants from different countries, think of the Eurovision Song Contest. It really becomes much more than the contestant themselves. So you have a young woman who's an artist singing, competing, but whether she likes it or not, she becomes a representative, an ambassador of her country, if you will. And so you have nationalism then comes in, which is obviously about politics. And so, so it never ends. And then you discover how truly political popular culture can be.
Okay. And you also wrote another book called Hybridity and the Cultural Logic of Globalization, which is very influential and I love to read. And I would like to ask a question about that too, because you are dealing with a really controversial and complex issue there, hybridity, and then you are using the notion of critical transculturalism. And could you please specify critical transculturalism for our audience?
Yes. So I mean, the controversy around hybridity is basically the following: if you focus and if you celebrate cultural mixture, then you tend to ignore the power relations that constructed this mixture. So take it very basic levels. I'm trying to think of a good example. Think of a cocktail that has a little bit of alcohol and a lot of juice. Well, the impact of the alcohol, of the cocktail, comes from the alcohol. So that in a way, it's a power relation, that one ingredient is more powerful, more potent than other ingredient. The same thing applies to cultural mixture. And so when you tend to celebrate mixture, you celebrate it, the fear is that you celebrate it at the expense of the components of that mixture, which could have been unequal from the beginning. So that if people around the world are adopting traditions and foods and singing styles and melodies from other countries, one of the things you notice is that it's very often a few countries that tend to export a lot of these ideas and others that tend to adapt to them. And so the notion of critical transculturalism is basically one that recognizes cultural mixture, but that really focuses on how different actors construct different kinds of hybridity. So you have the examples of hybridity in food, which tends to be very, innocent in some ways. But you also have different kinds of hybrid. For instance, racial, cultural hybridities, where in some countries in the world, hybridity is used as a way to neutralize, for instance, the political aspirations of a minority group. So instead of allowing a Native American tribe to say, look, we're not represented politically, we need a bigger share of political power in the country, what you do is you say, oh, your food is great, and the rugs that you weave are fantastic, and all the little handicrafts you make are great. And that's the kind of hybridity that incorporates cultural expressions from subaltern groups, but without recognizing their political aspirations. And so in that sense, by using the word critical, it really reflects a focus on issues of power, while at the same time acknowledging that cultural mixture does happen, and not only does it happen, but it's the norm around the world.
Okay, wonderful. I would like to ask also another question, which is related to that also. Because we know that Turkish media texts are becoming more and more popular in the Middle East.
Yes.
And how can we position or place Turkish media in the Middle Eastern mediascape? And what do you tell us about that in terms of power relations and what is happening in the Middle East?
Well, one of the interesting things about Turkish media is that until 10 years ago, no Arabs had ever heard of any program made in Turkey. And that changed a few years ago with the popularity of Turkish drama series, especially Gümüş, that was very popular in the Arab world, especially in the Gulf countries. Now, why is that significant? It's significant at a variety of levels. Number one, the show became very popular in countries that did not have indigenous traditions of television drama production. So that's point number one. Point number two, there's something about a lot of these programs that are not only about Turkey, but about a cosmopolitan elite in Istanbul, with a lot of pictures of the Bosphorus, a lot of pictures of some of the landmarks of Istanbul. Typically, they tend to portray upper-class people who have quite a bit of money, who live in gorgeous houses or apartments, and who somehow manage to project a lifestyle and an identity that seems to mix the best of East and West, to use a cliche, a stereotype. I think that's what was very attractive. So in the case of Gümüş, for instance, you have a couple that struggles with all the problems of modernity. How do you sustain two jobs? How do you, in a society that generally favors the rights of men over women, and that's not just applies to Turkey, but we're talking worldwide, what is exactly women's roles? Once women who are professional become mothers, what are the challenges they face? And so they did all of this without, however, abandoning what we could call traditional values. You know, the value of having family, the value of having a spiritual life, things of that sort. So I think that combination, perhaps the best way to describe it is a kind of hybridity. You know, it's a kind of basically made in Istanbul hybridity of you know, in a city that's geographically positioned between East and West, to do that culturally, that appealed to many people across the Arab world. Now, that doesn't mean that that happened in a vacuum of drama, because we have Syrian drama that's very good. Egyptian drama historically has been dominant, but I think the entrance of Turkish drama doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a context where Turkey is becoming a more important player in the Middle East. In the absence of any Arab political project until the uprisings a year ago, Turkey was one of 2 or 3 countries that actually did have an agenda in the Middle East. One of political influence, one of economic growth. You know, Iran is another of those countries. And so one of the things I think that we should really focus on is how popular culture often goes hand in hand with political developments, whether the export of a television drama, to what extent it is parallel to a change in foreign policy, which are all things that we've seen in the case of Turkey. There's something else also, which is that Turkish drama and Turkish film has been approaching topics in ways that are markedly different, for instance, from for instance, how Hollywood approaches topics about the Middle East. So there have been some movies that show the Palestinian guerrilla as the hero, as opposed to the evil terrorist, for instance. And those kinds of things, you know, it reverses the Hollywood narrative of who the good guy being the blonde white Westerner and the bad guy being the brown Middle Easterner. By reversing this scenario, I think it's capturing a sense of frustration and resentment about how stories are told. About people in the Arab world watching, for instance, movies where they only see themselves as the bad guys, as the evil guys, as the people who kill other people or blow other people up or intolerant or all that. And there have been some Turkish movies that were popular precisely because they do it the other way around. They say, look, these are normal people. They're not intolerant. There's nothing specifically evil about them. They just think differently. And I think that's a very powerful formula, which really presents what is perhaps best described as an accessible kind of modernity. It's a modernity that doesn't abandon traditions. And I think that's perhaps the secret of the success of these drama series.
I see. And also, I would like to ask about, more what Turkish, how they are perceived in the Middle East. Because in your articles and in your books, you are discussing that media texts are opening new possibilities to debate, contentious issues like national sovereignty, national identity, authenticity. And I would like to ask how Turkish television series contribute to these kind of discussions in the Middle East.
Well, I mean, there's, for instance, I can tell you about at least one specific case. So the case of Gümüş in Saudi Arabia. There were several cases of women not showing up to work because they wanted to stay and watch the episode of Gümüş. They recorded the evening and they wanted to watch it 4 or 5 times. And it started a debate about when they're criticized for doing that, they say, to Saudi Arabia, look, the protagonist of the series, look how he treats his wife. That's how you should treat your wives. So it became, in a sense, a model of what it means to be a good man, or what the ideal masculinity should be about. So in that sense, that filtered into social debate, right? So that was one example. I mean, not only Turkish drama did this, but Turkish drama, again, because it's different enough and yet accessible in terms of, what scholars call cultural proximity. Evidently, there are lots of common cultural traits. The food is similar, behavior tends to be similar, the way people dress between Turkey and its Arab neighbors. That kind of what we call proximity allows for social resonance to happen and for people to say, look, that's why I'm watching this instead of going to work, because it's interesting. Why is it interesting? Well, because it showcases a model of how a man should treat his wife. Now, which is not to say, I mean, and people have written about this and say, look, don't start arguing that, all Turkish men are the ideal husbands. That's not the point. The point is there's a series that showcases this couple. And it has been used by women who don't like how they are treated to say that's how you should treat me.
Yeah. And today you gave us a wonderful speech about Arab Spring and the media. Could you please, just make a quick summary of this talk, because it was really, really very influential and eye-opening.
Thank you. I mean, the main point of the talk is that a lot of the representations of the Arab Spring, a lot of the media coverage, is not based on solid basis or on foundations in reality, for a variety of reasons. Some of them are ideological, but the main reason being is that no journalists or observers have had access to what's going on. The only people who seem to have access to what's going on in Syria, for instance, are participants in the events themselves. And when participants in events represent those events, they tend to represent them according to their own agenda. So whether you are with the government or against the government, you will tend to spin the message in a certain way. And we've had, as I mentioned in the colloquium, we've had several cases of events that people assumed to be completely true, that became big media stories, and then a few days later we realized that's a hoax, or somebody created a character out of the blue. The woman who was supposedly found decapitated and tortured and raped and skinned even shows up on TV very, very alive, very well, very articulate a few days later. And so the one thing that I focused on was how the situation seems to be like Plato's cave, where people who are chained in front of a wall inside a cave see projections of shadows on the wall, and then after a while begin to think that those shadows are reality. While in fact we know that shadows don't show reality, or don't show all of reality. And so the phenomenon of social media and new media like Facebook and Twitter, instead of adding clarity and adding details, factual details to the coverage, in fact they've become an echo chamber for that digital cave, where rumors are amplified to the point that they become true for some people, even though they're not true. And this is, this becomes even more the case when you realize that a lot of people writing about the Arab Spring, for instance, don't know Arabic, and so therefore don't have access to primary sources. And for people like that, whatever is available in English will become very important. Most of the things available in English that are made within these countries, Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, Yemen, tend to be on social media by local activists who write in English. And so what a lot of academics and reporters begin to think is that small segment that is in the English language in fact represents the totality of social reality, and therefore they recreate a lot of the mistakes. And we've had several, as I said, very strange cases of people who were found dead to be found alive, people who were very much alive to be found to be fictional creations a few days later, and so on and so forth.
Okay, and as you know, this is the 100th anniversary of Marshall McLuhan's birth. And in terms of, cultural, economic, and political implications of social media today, do you still think that medium is the message?
That's a difficult question. I think instead of focusing on medium and message, I prefer to think of a term that many people have used, not McLuhan, but many other people, starting from Hegel, which is the notion of mediation, which is you have media and you have messages, and you have mediators and you have messengers, and somehow between all of these, there's meaning is created. And meaning is shaped by participants in events. Some meanings are resisted by some of the participants, and so I'm not very comfortable focusing on the medium at the expense of not only the message or the content, but most importantly the context of reception, the context in which meaning is ultimately made. I think is absolutely crucial. And of course, there's a tendency, and we will stay with this tendency, to glorify technologies. I sense a theme historically in coverage of the Arab world that somehow, especially in Western discourse, specifically in American, both academic and media discourses, about people in the Middle East not having political and social agency, not being able to change their lives for the better unless they have the right technology in their hand. And obviously the technology is oftentimes a Western creation. And so there's a sense of kind of a latent kind of racism where people cannot do things on their own. Somehow they're different from Westerners who can require and ask and fight for their political and social rights. And somehow with Arabs especially, but Middle Easterns and Muslims more largely, they need the technology, they need the little gizmo that will change their lives for the better. We've seen it in the case of the video cassette recorder in the 70s. We've seen it with television in the 50s. We've seen it with blogs in the 90s, and then with Facebook, Twitter, and whatever is coming next in this decade.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Kraidy, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.